back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the revolutions of 1848, right? A very pivotal year in European history that I believe personally is a little bit undersold, because when you see not one, not two, but 17 different revolutions break out all over the European continent, and they tend to follow this similar pattern, I feel like it's probably a pretty big deal, but a lot of people are going to undersell it. But going into it, though, what we have to understand is we do not have much to talk about in this flip. We are just talking about the revolutions of 1848, what's going to end up happening, and then in class, we're going to start talking about the modernization of Russia, and then also socialism, and the growing ideas of communism and stuff like that. But right now, y'all, we are hauling through some content, and I am so proud of y'all and so impressed. So let's keep this flip nice and short and let's get after it, right? But where we left off in class, we were discussing and talking about the Great Famine, right? The Irish potato famine being a very key example of that Great Famine, causing bread riots throughout most of the European continent, driving up bread prices, also leading to the death and starvation of over 1 million people in Ireland, right? And also causing mass immigration. But then we started moving into the fact that the poor feel very, very, very unrepresented, underutilized, and then also very, very unheard, right? We're also seeing that the liberals, the classical liberals, are beginning to get very, very frustrated with the conservatives because they are demanding constitutions and these ideas of nationalism. No empires, more countries. And everybody's starting to get really, really upset. And what's going to end up happening is in the year of 1848, starting in France and then it's spreading throughout the continent again, right? This will be literally France's third revolution that we've talked about in this entire class, which is crazy. So going into it, though, you have to understand that it will spread throughout the entire continent, and they all seem to follow a very specific pattern. That pattern being the springtime of the peoples, where the liberals and the socialists come together to accomplish their goals. They throw up barricades and they demand new rights. They get those rights, but then eventually the liberals start being like, I don't think everyone should vote. And the socialists are like, I think everyone should vote. They start to argue with each other, and then the conservatives swoop in, take the classical liberals and run away with them, and then suppress the socialist movements that were actually showing up, and they begin to roll back a lot of these revolutionary reforms, right? So we have to understand the reason why a lot of these, like this movement, this moment, this era in European history, why it doesn't get a lot of credit. A lot of it has to do with the fact that when you really look at all these revolutions, it seems as though they all failed, right? So when we're looking at a series of failed revolutions, it's why a lot of historians and a lot of people don't talk about it a ton, but I still think it's a really, really important moment, because it's when that pot boiled over, right? It's when that moment came when all of y'all like talked about how, like, if you don't pay attention to something, it will collapse, right? So going into it, we're going to pick up first on the revolution of 1848 in France, and then we're going to talk about the one in Austria that actually is going to see the rise of a very important guy that we're going to talk about later on in World War I, and then we're going to talk about the one that happens in Prussia and about this gutter crown, right? So going into it, though, we start off with France, all right? And so the last time we left off, you have to remember that there's a new king of France, right? And that new king of France is named Louis, Duke of Orleans, right? Louis Philippe, Duke of Orleans, right? And he is the last king of France, right? There'll be an emperor. We'll talk about that later. But going into it, though, you have to understand he is that last king of France, okay? And the socialists and the liberals at the time were actually really, really dissatisfied with Louis Philippe I, right? They were like, yo, bro, we brought you in here because we thought you were going to be all like cool and liberal and progressive and not like annoying. Even the Marquis de Lafayette walked his old butt over to you and draped you in the French flag because you were our symbol of hope when we ran off Charles X, right? Well, it turns out that he wasn't as liberal as everyone thought. He actually gave a lot of power to aristocrats, a lot of power to these old nobles, and kind of was just more of the same, right? And so a lot of pamphlets start coming out, and a lot of periodicals where they begin to compare him to a pear, right? And apparently calling someone a pear in French means calling them like a slovenly idiot, right? And so literally this article is going like, look at the transformation of Louis Philippe into the pear, right? And like literally making fun of him. And actually people are getting so frustrated with him, y'all, that they try to assassinate him at one point. There was an assassination attempt on Louis Philippe's life by an individual who literally took the barrels of over 20 different guns, loaded all of them, and tried to fire all of them at him at once, right? And it actually ended up killing several people in the crowd, but only one bullet grazed Louis Philippe's forehead. That right there is actually a reproduction of this crazy mechanism this person tried to use to actually execute him with. It was called the Machine Infernale, which means like the infernal machine. The guy that actually tried to build it and execute him was an actual like socialist liberal supporter, and and he ends up dead, as you can see, via the guillotine, right? This is actually a painting of his severed head sitting on top of some documents and bloodying them next to a revolutionary red cap, right? So now going into it, though, as you can tell, Louis Philippe, not very loved. So bread riots are beginning to break out in 1848 throughout most areas of France, and it's going to end up actually sweeping through Paris. Louis Philippe is actually going to decide, you know, the best way to handle a bread riot? Shoot him. And so he has a bunch of people shot, killing 50 people in one bread riot that actually broke out in Paris. Well, you know what? The socialists and the liberals are like, you know what, big fella? You gonna shoot at us, we gonna shoot back, right? So they started building barricades. And like I said before, if there was an Olympic sport for building barricades, the French would win every single time. Look at these behemoths of barricades, right? Made out of pieces of scrap and cobblestones ripped out of the streets and wheels thrown into a big pile. And they're literally just sitting on the other side while the military marches at them, popping up over the edge and shooting back at them, right? Turning basically the city itself into their defense structure, right? Which is absolutely genius. Louis Philippe, when he sees this happen, is going to do exactly what Charles X does, and he abdicated out of fear, right? And the monarchy will be abolished. Yet again! Wait a minute. Mr. Terry, haven't we seen this before? Haven't we witnessed the monarchy be abolished in France before? Yes. Very, very good, Molly. That is an exactly right question. We have seen this before. Happened in 1793 after they killed Louis XVI during the French Revolution, leading into the Reign of Terror, right? But the French thought they were going to do it better this time. They were like, no, this time we will be the French Second Republic, and we'll do it better. We won't go all Reign of Terror-y. It's like, now, sorry for the Kronk voice. Now, going into it, though, the new government is going to come in and just be represented by a grand legislative body, right? A huge legislative branch that will act much like a Congress, right? And so this new national convention will come in and they ban slavery. They establish universal male suffrage, which is a big deal. That's right. The French, persuaded by the socialists, are going to allow every man, regardless of class, the ability to vote, right? Not for the ladies, though. Sorry. But they're also going to usher in this thing known as the 10-hour workday, limiting the number of hours that you can force someone to work to 10, right? And they're going to bring in a lot of other reforms as well, but something's going to really, really get bad. This new legislative branch, though, is going to show divisions quickly, because remember the common pattern, right? The socialists and liberals unite, conservatives run away out of fear because of the barricades, and then divisions emerge, right? And the divisions began to emerge when it came to how much aid would be given to the poor, right? So the new legislative branch will show divisions quickly when we use this one particular example known as the workshops example, right? So basically what happened is the socialists that existed within inside this new national convention demanded that workshops be built throughout the multitude of Paris and all the major cities. And these workshops would basically be state-owned factories that would be forced to actually have jobs available for people to have at a livable wage, right? So basically you've got government-created jobs, right? Well, what's going to end up happening, though, is that these new workshops are going to attract so much attention that mass urbanization happened all at once, and they were not able to sustain themselves, and they weren't able to keep up with hiring, and they weren't able to keep up with the demand for work. And so what ends up happening is the liberals vote to close those workshops, basically leaving a bunch of people that have just moved to these cities with no work whatsoever, right? This would lead to more barricades, except this time the socialists would throw out the barricades alone, without the support of many of the classical liberals, right? And what's going to happen is the conservatives come in with their military and they're like, classical liberals, you see what happens when you allow people to vote with their stomachs? And they court them back over, right? And they enter in with a very, very large army. They shoot down these socialists. It's much easier for them because there's not as much of a force of them. And they decide to, instead of just going pure republic, they create a new strong executive. That's right, France gets a president, right? And France's first president will be a man by the name of Napoleon III, right? The days after, in 1849, when everybody got shot and stuff like that in France, actually under the orders of this gentleman right here, Napoleon III, who is, yes, Napoleon's nephew, right? The guy, Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, right, becomes president. And this is crazy. This is an actual picture of the barricades that were built during the June days when Napoleon's armies shot and killed the conservatives in the streets when they actually rioted because of the workshops being closed, right? And so that is a really, really great example of these revolutions of 1848, as you can see. And all the ones throughout Europe pretty much for the most part followed that pattern, right? Socialists and liberals come together, socialists and liberals start arguing, conservatives support liberals, and then socialists get suppressed, right? So like now, and many of the reforms get rolled back. So going into it, they did keep their legislative body, and they did keep some of these different elements, like more like larger, grander suffrage, but they are going to have a new guy that's in charge who's very conservative and very strong, being Napoleon III. And we'll talk about him a little bit more later on, because he's going to actually come up in the back half of this unit when we talk about what he does to Paris. Now, going into it, though, also you have to understand, this is going to follow a similar pattern in both Austria and Prussia, right? In Austria, you're going to see a revolution of 1848 that is a huge mess, mostly due to the fact that Austria is a grand empire. It's very, very large, and it controls tons of people that don't speak German. Now, for those of y'all be like, Mr. Terry, Austrians, I thought spoke Austrian. No, they speak German, right? So now, like, you have to understand, though, Austrians, okay, are a very different type of German-speaking people than what you now consider Germany, right? They're mostly Catholic. They have a very different history, right? So going into it, though, you have to understand Austria is a big mess, though, because they control a lot of people that aren't Austrian, right? The empire in Austria controls places like Hungary, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, and all of these other areas within their empire, right? Slovenians or Slovenes is what they're called. So what's going to happen, though, is barricades get thrown up in a lot of different places, including in Hungary, and they're demanding a lot of different stuff, right? They're like, they see what happened in Paris, and they were like, ooh, their king abdicated and ran away when they built barricades. Let's do the same thing, right? And they demand a thing like the end to the corvées, right? What a corvée is, by the way, is a tax of labor, right? Basically, it's forcing someone to work, like build roads and stuff like that, and not get paid, but it's like a form of taxation, right? They want an end to that. They want an end to serfdom throughout the empire. They want freedom of the press, and they want independence for a lot of these different areas, particularly Hungarians do. Hungarians are like, we want independence from you, Austria, right? We want to be just Hungary, not with you underneath the Austrian Empire, right? Now, going into it, this will change face a little bit later on. There's a dual leadership thing. So what's going to end up happening, though, is Emperor Ferdinand, who's in charge of Austria at the time, yet again, abdicates. And some of y'all probably should be asking yourself, well, Mr. Terry, I thought that guy Clemens von Metternich was from Austria. You're right. He is, right? And what ends up happening during the revolutions of 1848, the guy that literally created the Age of Metternich between 1815 and 1848 is going to run away and flee to London like a pansy, right? Like, so he just runs off in the face of a revolution, right? Shows how strong you are, big dog. He runs away and flees to London, and many of these reforms will be accomplished, right? Then into the corvée, serfdom begins to be repealed in many of the Austrian territories. However, they get a new emperor, right? When Ferdinand I abdicated, a new guy shows up. His name is Franz Joseph, right? He's very, very young, and he's very, very conservative. All right, so yeah, and what he decides, though, is he's like, look, there will be divisions that emerge. And they do. The classical liberals and the socialists are feuding with each other over who gets what and who goes where. And so the new emperor, in the midst of that confusion, Franz Joseph calls up the big boy, Russia, one of their conservative allies that have been their allies for a really long time, and says, hey, you want to come in here and crush some revolts? And the Russians are like, yes, I do want to crush a revolt. So yeah, and they come in and they wipe them out, right? And they pretty much destroy them, bringing in a new conservative emperor who's very aggressive and refuses to let many of these countries go, right? But this is going to bleed into our next unit when we talk about nationalism, all right? And last but not least, we have the Prussians, right? The Prussians are going to have rioters in the streets of major cities like Berlin, all right? So now, look, you've heard of Berlin. It's now the current modern-day capital of what you now call Germany, right? So going into it, though, barricades there would be thrown up demanding a liberal constitution. And they also want a legislative body because Prussia, as we know, has been an absolute government for a really long time. When you look at Frederick the Great, and then when you also look at like enlightened absolutism and what he ushered in, right? And he actually did a lot of reforms, got a lot of things accomplished, okay? But what we also have to understand is, like, is he enlightened absolutist or was he more of an enlightened despot? Because he didn't do everything perfectly. But they want a liberal constitution. They want a legislative body that they can vote for. They want a parliament, right? And so they demand that, and they get it, which is crazy. They want and they actually create this thing called the Frankfurt Parliament in the city of Frankfurt, right, inside of Prussia. And they're like, this will be our new liberal style government. This will be our new liberal Congress that will demand things. And also, we're going to write a constitution that our king will sign. And his name was Frederick William IV, right? The Kaiser at the time was forced to sign this new constitution, and basically he would become a constitutional monarch, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is that this didn't quite sit right with Frederick, right? Frederick William IV goes like, I don't know if I like the idea of being a limited monarch. That doesn't really sound very cool to me. And a lot of people within the Frankfurt Parliament begin demanding this. I need you to highlight that bad boy right there. You see that where it says a unified German state? A bunch of people in the Frankfurt Parliament begin to say, hey, we should be Germany. We should be a unified German country, right? We have many of our different people, our allies, our brethren that speak German and eat all the same foods and sing all the same songs and have all the same stories that we do. Why are we not one giant country? Well, this really made Frederick William upset. And what he does is he uses a very small war that breaks out, okay, in the nearby territories, and he liquidates the Frankfurt Parliament, which means to dissolve them, just like Charles did, just like James did, dissolves them. And when they're dissolved, he rewrites a new conservative constitution because he said, and I quote, "I refuse to take this crown from the gutter," right? So basically he's referring to the whole idea of being a constitutional monarch rather than an absolute monarch as being a garbage version of a monarch, right? He's like, I don't want this gutter crown, right? And so instead he wants his old absolutist one back. So he literally waited around for divisions in that parliament to emerge and used a small war to dissolve them and then roll a bunch of these reforms back, right? So yet again, you see another failed revolution in 1848. But now what we're going to be getting into in our next thing that we talk about is going to be this, the modernization of Russia, right? Because we're going to talk a little bit about why these things didn't break out, why the revolutions of 1848 did not break out in Russia, but we're also going to talk about how Russia was a little behind the eight ball when it came to technology and industrialization at the time. But we'll talk about all that stuff when we have class tomorrow, because we're going to have 2 slides that we have to go over in class, and then we're going to start talking about socialism. But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all